So the
I was very fortunate that I grew up in New York City at the time that I did in the 80s when the pioneering generation of artists that started this movement were still around. You can maybe find them. The next two or three generations are still around. There was a photographer that was documenting this all named Henry Chalfant, who had a studio in Soho and on Wooster Street, who would allow artists to come over and see his photos of the trains that he'd been taking for many years. And I became friends with Henry as a kid, and Henry would allow us to come into the studio to see all these great work. And so I learned history through looking at the photos and then meeting some of these artists that would show up at Henry's.
mm,
And like Lee Quinones as an example, Lee Quinones in the graffiti world is a god. He is Picasso. He's beyond Picasso. In 1978 and 1977, he had hundreds of murals on the sides of trains, the most wonderful things ever, well into the early 80s. And so, and the most incredible public walls in his neighborhood. And I remember as a kid meeting him at Henry's, and Henry had given him his studio to paint, and he was
mm.
creating his works there. And so it blew my mind. And I would go to his neighborhood to find his walls, to photograph his walls. And so I was just a young kid at the right place at the right time that was fortunate enough to become friends with Henry and meet these artists, and they acknowledged me because I was now painting trains and I was now out and about. And that really inspired me. And by the time I was in high school, the first graffiti zine came out, which was called IGT, or the International Graffiti Times, and later it was changed to TIGHT, the International Get Hip Times, by one of the founders of the graffiti movement, one of the pioneers rather, Phase 2, who started painting in 1971. And here's this older man, radical black militant, creating the zine with this weird downtown artist, and they were creating an incredible zine that was documenting history, doing interviews with writers, showing old photos and new photos. And I fell in love with it, and I became a contributor in high school to the zine. I started sending them photography, and they started publishing my work. And that was the beginning of my interest in the publishing world. And that inspired me to become a publisher myself. And so in college, I published a sort of, I guess you could call it a street magazine that covered graffiti and the streets and prisons and radical movements and resistance and rebellion and things that were happening in the prison system. But it all came out of my passion for graffiti and this sort of connection that was happening of me being involved in different types of street culture and meeting people and, you know, connecting with ideas and then, you know, trying to do something about it.